Well, good evening. Welcome to tonight's event. Welcome into Church of the Ascension. My name is Father Billy Daniel. I'm the rector here in Ascension, and it is our great privilege to host Mallory McDuff, author of Our Last Best Act. And for those of you who have not been in this space, I just want you to know that many holy conversations happen in this place. It is a place of prayer, but of good and thoughtful conversation. And so Ascension is a place where meaningful conversations happen, and we are grateful that you are here to be part of tonight's. On your way out, there are books. If you did not get one on your way in, there are also little sheets out there that tell you what's going on in Church of the Ascension. For those of you who follow the calendar, Lent is upon us, and so there are many ways for you to make your holy devotion here in this place, and we invite you so to do. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bishop Cole, who will introduce our featured guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Billy. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. It is my great pleasure to introduce Betty Corey's cousin. Raise your hand if you know Betty Corey. Okay, excellent. Betty Corey, longtime member here at Ascension, and whenever I see Betty at the Kroger Knox Plaza, we always catch up on Cousin Mallory. And Mallory and I have been friends for now well over 20 years. First met when we were both teaching at Warren Wilson College in Swannanoa, North Carolina. Mallory is a native of Fairhope, Alabama, a lifelong Episcopalian connected to lots of Episcopal clergy and lay leaders. Went to school at Vanderbilt, University of Florida, and is a thoughtful teacher and writer, and has written a great new book, Our Last Best Act, Planning for the End of Our Lives to Protect the People and Places We Love. Mallory, as a way of welcoming you back to Knoxville, I got you this little bracelet, and you'll notice 4 skulls on the bracelet. So there's this great Christian practice where we're invited to remember our death. And so that prayer, that rosary, comes from a ministry that's encouraging people to kind of reclaim that practice of remembering our death as a way of disarming death, putting death in its right place in our life. And I thought, who do I know who needs a bracelet like that? And you came to mind. So welcome back to Knoxville and to Church of the Ascension.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you all so much for being here. I know it's been a rainy day. And so what a delight to walk in to the sanctuary and see you all. So I just really want to thank you for being here. The last time I was in this space, and seeing Susan there really makes me remember as well. The last time I was on this space was when Brian was ordained as a bishop. So, and we joke because it was my, at the time, 11-year-old's birthday. She was thrilled to be attending church on her birthday. So it's great to be here on this occasion too, and just thank y'all for having me. Thank you for the gift.
Yeah, so you've written in the past a lot of books on faith and the environment. You write a lot about being a mom to your kids, living in a 900 square foot house, Warren Wilson College. You've written on various topics. How did this idea of this book come to you?
Well, the impetus for the book really was my parents' deaths. And my mother, Ann Jones, was Betty Corey's first cousin. My mom was killed when she was about my age in a cycling accident. She was biking from a Christian yoga class actually to a farm where they volunteered. My dad volunteered in exchange for organic vegetables. And she was hit by a teen driver and died instantly. And in the month after her death, my dad sat us down, his grown children. I mean, we drove for the weekend. He said, I want to meet with all of y'all. This was after the funeral, but about a month after her death. And he presented us with 2 pages of directives, very specific plan for his funeral. And, you know, quite honestly, y'all, I thought he was this was his way of grieving, you know, to plan for his own death. And it might have been. But he was very specific. He wanted a pine casket. He wanted to build it himself. And when I was in middle school, he actually built a prototype of a casket. So he'd grown up talking about he didn't want fake artificial lawn on the, by the burial site. He wanted family and friends involved. He wanted no embalming, no concrete vault. So this was a conversation that was kind of in the background of my childhood, but yet after my mother's death, it was on 2 type single-space pages. So what happened only 2 years after her death was that he too was killed in a very similar accident by another teen driver under the influence, and he died instantly. And so what I thought was this practice for his own grieving was actually preparation for us for dealing with his death. So we had a roadmap. We had a place to. We had directions, and we were able to do almost everything on his list. So that all happened, and I had, in my own directives, my final wishes, I had stated flame cremation. It was cheap, it was convenient. I'm a single mom of 2 kids. I thought, okay, this would be easy for them to do. But in the years after my parents' deaths, I became aware of more and more options that were more sustainable than flame cremation, which is essentially burning fossil fuels for a couple hours. And so at that time, I thought, I need to just explore what's out there, you know, and just see, are there other options that maybe I should be aware of? Particularly, I teach environmental education, so it felt sort of like a moral obligation to at least explore the options. So that's what I did. I took 1 year to explore the options for myself and then ultimately revise my final wishes.
So as a parish priest for years, I have a lot of experience of sitting with families who are making decisions about a liturgy, about final wishes. And in sitting with them, this was true in Asheville, North Carolina, it was true in Lexington, the only question I knew to ask around what to do with your body was casket or cremation. So for me, just the process of reading this book, obviously having this conversation with you about this book, realizing there are a lot more options out there than I realized. And so in some ways, even when a person does their final directive, it's not final.
Right.
It can just be revisited as we know more about caring for the land, caring for our bodies. In many ways, for me, again, a part of giving you the bracelet, I do feel like in the book you are inviting folk in a variety of ways, and at times ways for Annie Skye, you know, maybe she'd like you to stop talking about this as her mother, but you are inviting us to remember our death and to think about these practices. I think there's a section from the opening. Did you want to read that section?
Sure.
About the why?
Yeah, well, we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit to give you snippets from the book and just have a conversation together. And just to let y'all know, I'm a teacher, so I like to give the agenda in advance. Imagine a board here. So we'll also have time at the end for questions too, for sure. And then I will sign books. So I'm just going to read just a little bit from the start of this journey. And a lot of these scenes do involve my youngest daughter. So what's so crazy is that this actually started at a conference. I mean, the idea for this book started at a conference at the Cathedral of All Souls in Asheville, where Brian was a priest and where I attended. So I was a speaker at a conference when I realized this conference at All Souls, I don't actually know everything that's out there, you know, which is funny. Like, you would go to speak at a conference and then realize you actually have a lot to learn. So that's the context for this little scene. So that evening after the conference, I opened the file cabinet in my bedroom and took out the folder containing my will, cremation directive, and advanced care directive, which I hadn't touched in more than a decade. It was like trying on a pair of jeans from high school. My sister was listed as the healthcare power of attorney, but she'd moved from Atlanta to Seattle. I'd totally forgotten my instructions for a party after my funeral with beer and barbecue from Okie Dokie Smokehouse, a restaurant I loved when my young children needed a quick fix of mac and cheese and ribs on a school night. It claimed to offer swine dining. Since that time, my 2 daughters had grown from toddlers to teens, and my hair had turned a soft gray like my mother's. Sitting on my bedroom floor beside the file cabinet, I remembered the instructions given by Caroline, the director of the Center for End-of-Life Transitions at the conference. I'd picked up a refrigerator magnet from her and a Ziploc bag for the documents labeled Matters of Life and Death inside. I hoped to have years ahead to prepare my children for my absence, but after revisiting my wishes, I wanted to feel more prepared for the unknowns ahead. I told my 21-year-old daughter, Maya, about the option of keeping my body at home until the funeral. "Oh, Mom, no thanks." She explained, "If your body was in the house, I'd feel like it was haunted. I just don't think I could sleep." My 14-year-old Annie Skye had a more direct response. "I will sleep in a Motel 6 if that happens. I know how much it costs and I can pay for it myself." They couldn't imagine spending a day in the presence of my dead body, and I didn't blame them. Clearly, my journey to revise my own wishes as a single mother would need to involve my children. During our small but meaningful lives, we were in this together for now and evermore. And so the journey started.
So the journey starts, and a thing I've always appreciated about you is how curious you are about people. So to me, in reading the book, as we kind of watch you look at these different ways of thinking about the use of the body and disposing of the body, for you, you're not just looking at topics or looking at options and the pros and cons, you're also meeting the people connected to those options, and again, sort of honoring their lives. I appreciate how sympathetic you are about even folks who maybe are very much involved in a funeral home industry in a way that you see you see the shortcomings of some of those options, and yet you continue to see the goodness of those people. And so for you, even as you're making discernment about your choices, you continue to choose people. And I appreciate that as your friend and as someone watching you as a writer, how generous you are with those folk. So I'm curious for you, are there some particular things, particular people that you met or options that you met that particularly stand out in this year journey?
There's so many people, and as you were talking, the one person came to mind, and you know the people that stand out to you, sometimes they're the ones that are most critical of you. I don't know if that hasn't happened to y'all. So there was a funeral director who gave a lot to me. I mean, everybody that I encountered in this book gave to me in terms of their time. They didn't have to. I was asking to participate. I mean, I went to home funerals. I was a part of, met funeral directors. I was a volunteer at a conservation cemetery, which is a cemetery where the land is protected in perpetuity through conservation easements. Y'all have one in Tennessee, Larkspur Conservation, outside of Nashville. So all these people were letting me be a part of their lives and their deaths. But as you were talking, one person did stand out to me, and this was a funeral director who let me shadow her. She let me spend a lot of time with her. And she also pointed out my biases against the funeral industry, some of which had been shaped by my father, right? He did not want a funeral home involved in his death at all. And she pointed out to me that I needed to keep a more open mind. And I think that's such an interesting perspective. I went back and sort of rewrote scenes that I had written about her. Everybody I wrote, I wanted them to read. This wasn't like an expose book. I wanted people to read and be comfortable with what I had written. And I really went back and really examined my own assumptions. And I think in doing that, I was able to really see how the collaboration between the folks doing green burial and the conventional funeral industry, the win-win is going to come and is coming, when there's some synergy between those two, when it's not just, the conventional funeral industry does this and the folks doing more green, are on some other side, but some collaboration between the two. And when I really sat down to think about it, in the case of my dad's death, my sister and I were able to actually prepare his body for burial. Because of the accident, his body was taken to the coroner's office and then to a local funeral home in Alabama. And because we just asked, can we prepare his body for burial? We don't need anything done. All we need is for you to keep the body cool. They said yes. And we were able to be in that space. And the irony of it all is that was a collaboration between our family and a conventional funeral director who had probably never been asked that ever.
Yeah, because I remember when your dad died, a friend of ours, I think, called me and said your father had died. And I remember saying to them initially, no, that was Mallory's mom. That was a couple years ago. And they're like, no, it's happened again. And I remember at the time, not knowing how you recover from that. I never met your mom. I know her as a photograph on your refrigerator. I met your dad, had the chance to go run with him along the Warren Wilson Trail. I've always said to people about your parents, they were Episcopalians who practiced yoga, were vegetarians who hiked the Appalachian Trail. They should live to be 150 years old. And they both died prematurely from these horrific accidents. In the book, at the end of the book, you write a letter to your daughters. I'm curious, could Mallory today imagine talking to Mallory in the aftermath of your father's death and say, no, wait, you're going to write a book.
No.
You're going to write a book about death and dying, and because I'm curious to what degree this has been a part of even how you work with, reflect on, bless their lives. To think about you writing this book, of all people, to me, is just a remarkable achievement. So I'm just curious to think about going back to talk to Mallory on the day of that accident. Can you imagine that?
Yes, well, no and yes. No, I don't think it would have happened. That any of us, I think I'm 56 now, and I think, you reach whatever age, and everybody has experienced some trauma, some traumatic events, usually plural, whether they involve death or, other traumas. That's, and then, so to me, my younger self, in my late 30s would not have imagined I'm going to write a book about it, or in a lot of essays. But what was happening was I was writing a lot and writing essays, and I basically couldn't stop writing about my parents. My friends would be like, oh yeah, another essay about, but it wasn't really just about them. It was their lives or deaths were connected to bigger issues. In this case, this is how do I look at death and dying from the lens of climate change and community. Those were the two things. And I teach environmental education. I'm with young people all the time who are grappling with these. How do they engage when things seem so big, right? And for me, our deaths it's the one thing that we're the only people that can make decisions about that. And if we don't, we can pretty much be guaranteed somebody else will, and it's going to probably be a pain for them,
Yeah.
So I don't think the writing of the book was this is how I'm dealing with grief to me, but you didn't say that, but some people have asked me that. For me, it's how do I continue to tell a story, but connect it to something that has meaning to other people. So, and I couldn't have, I think I've said the other day when we were talking, I couldn't have taken this, done this research if I was facing like an immediate death of my child or immediate terminal illness in myself. Like the fun, I mean, it was fun to meet all these people who their lives are about preparing others for death, but it was only, I got that enjoyment and that curiosity about other people because death was not imminent for me.
Well, and I don't know, I can't speak for Father Billy, but I know for me, when folks have come to see me in a parish and have said, I'm really healthy, everything's good, but I want to sit down and make all these choices now, it's again, I think it's a way that we disarm death and we sort of right-size it, and people leave the room lighter, because I think so often what I've experienced in the opposite is when no plans have been made, you then watch family members at times sort of paralyzed, thinking, I have to know what they would have wanted me to do. And so it's almost like another kind of trauma of, I'm going to choose the wrong hymn, or we're going to choose the wrong reader, or we're going to, and or other decisions about larger matters beyond the liturgy. And so to me, the practice of talking about death, remembering your death, picking up your death bracelet, remembering those last four things, is a way to, again, put it in proper perspective, not just in the Christian tradition, but I think any major world religion that talks about death, and it talks about more than, I think a part of how we live well is to reflect appropriately on death. Mm-hmm. I'm aware in the state of Tennessee, and I've learned this from you, that we have options. We have the practice of aquamation, which, if you've not heard of, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, at his death, requested aquamation, and that is legal in the state of Tennessee, both for your pet and for humans. So tell us about aquamation.
So I didn't even know about aquamation when I started this book. I'm just curious, how many of y'all have heard of aquamation? Wow, okay. Yeah, so, and again, I was teaching a class this afternoon, so forgive me if but it's a nice way for us for me to connect with y'all too. So I hadn't heard about it at all when I started the book, and I wanted to research, okay, with flame cremation, what are the impacts of it? And so in doing that research, I learned of aquamation, which Desmond Tutu just chose when he died at the end of 2021. Aquamation made the headlines because that was his choice. He was actually in a pine casket and then chose aquamation for his body. So it's categorized under cremation, but it's cremation by water and lye. So another word of it for it, or phrase for it, is water cremation or alkaline hydrolysis. So essentially the product looks similar to ashes. It's pulverized bones, which is essentially what ashes from flame cremation are. So every funeral director that I talked to really thought that aquamation was going to take off in terms of popularity. It's legal in 21 states, including Tennessee. And one thing you can do is calling crematories and saying, I'm really interested in this. I heard about this. Did you know Desmond Tutu chose this? Because I talked to funeral directors rather, who said, we really want to invest in this, but we have to convince daddy, or whatever in the family to put the money up. But the younger generation was like, we're going to do it. So I have friends in Asheville who are calling the funeral home that said this to me. It's in the book. And I didn't tell them to do this. But they said, I'm going to keep calling because I want aquamation. So it's fascinating. So that's an option. And it has been around for pets and so it's not new, but it's new for humans.
So what do we want aquamation?
Where do we want it
When
now?
do we want it later? Yeah, not right now, because I want it to be later. We also in Tennessee have the Conservation Cemetery Larkspur. So tell us about that process.
Yeah. So Becca Stevens, who's an Episcopal priest, some of y'all might know. Do you know Thistle Farms? Some of you do? Yeah, I love, it's such a great company to support. So Becca Stevens wrote the foreword to my book. I was so thrilled with that because I just think she hangs the moon. And she started the Conservation Cemetery, was a co-founder of Larkspur Conservation in Tennessee. And we have a conservation burial ground right outside of Asheville called Carolina Memorial Sanctuary. So as I was saying just a little bit earlier, it's this amazing concept where the dead actually help to conserve biodiversity and conserve the land. So you have the cemetery, but it goes into legal protection through conservation easements. So these are legal agreements that people can't develop on your property. And so ecological restoration is a big part of it, as well as just conservation of the land. And the other cool thing is that at least the funerals that I volunteered at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary, what's so different about those burials is that the family and friends are intimately involved in the way that fits them. So you might be helping to carry the casket to the grave site. You might be just shoveling the dirt on the grave, which is what we did for my father's funeral at a conventional cemetery. Wherever the location is, that chance to be connected to death, I think that's what has stood out for me. So that's the second one that we talked about first.
One other one that has to be mentioned because it's
Oh,
here
yeah.
in Knoxville, and many people maybe know Knoxville for this, is the Body Farm. How many of you know about oh my gosh. Wow, okay.
It's Knoxville.
It's Knoxville. Right. So tell us about the Body Farm.
So I had the opportunity, I had heard about the Body Farm here because it's Knoxville, right? Y'all follow? But I had no idea that there was a body farm in North Carolina, only 45 minutes from my house. So I did not visit the body farm here, but I ended up visiting the lab. And there's a chapter in the book about body farms and body composting, which is a whole nother option. But at a body farm, as y'all, most of you know already, you can donate your body to science and to the study of decomposition. So do y'all know, like, what's the difference between donating your body to the body farm here versus, like, to a medical school?
What is the difference?
Well, it's a good question. You don't have to embalm, your body's not embalmed when it goes to a body farm because you're studying decomposition, right? Embalming is the opposite of decomposition.
Right.
It's preservation of the body for, medical science.
So a body that's donated to science will be embalmed.
This donated to medical science.
Medical science.
Yeah, a body farm is considered science, but it's not medical science.
Just to be clear, there might be a body farm at Western Carolina, but what I know about the Vols fan is we have the best body farm in the SEC, right?
You have the first one.
Yes. Well, but again, these people are.
It's pretty strong as me against
Yeah.
them.
Anyway, I saw a lot of hands up. You wanted to read another section about your journey?
Yeah, I do. And I will just say this really quickly, that the connection to me from the body farm to a broader, because there's 7 body farms in the country. So, like, we're lucky, but, like, not everybody has that access. But what's so cool to me is that the research at the body farm at Western Carolina University was pivotal to the scientific process of body composting. I can't help but want to ask, has anybody heard of human composting, body composting? So this is another practice that's now legal in 3 states, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, and there's legislation introduced in many other states. I mean, it's a lot of people, I have so many friends who are like, oh, I want my body to go back to the earth, and I sound like I'm being facetious, but you can do that with human composting. Basically, they're taking the body, the companies that are doing this practice, and adding organic material, and your body then becomes composted soil that you can use. So it's a really, again, and this is a really super option for urban areas too, where there's not a lot of green space. So this is where my 14-year-old at the time, who's 16, would be like, you're getting a little too excited about these options. but it is pretty exciting to me. So I'm going to read just from one scene from the conservation burial ground outside of Asheville, where I volunteered as a parking attendant for a summer, just basically so I could be a part and observe burials there. And I ended up taking my students there as well. So I'm going to just share with you a little bit of that scene. This was a scene where this is the background, like I almost canceled class. It was freezing, it was just miserable, and it was the end of the semester. They didn't want to be there, I didn't want to be there. It's sad, but sometimes that happens. But I didn't cancel class, and I'm so glad I didn't, because then this happened. I wanted the students in my class to think critically about how death isn't only a personal loss. The ways we take our leave of this earth have consequences in communities. On a soggy, cold afternoon, we walked slowly past the mounded graves at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary as Warren Wilson alum and manager Cassie Barrett shared stories of the dead and updates on the ecological restoration of the wetland around us. Given the rain, I scanned the group for signs of hypothermia, just in case. As we gathered in a circle at the end of the tour, Cassie asked the students, "Was there anything uncomfortable about death that came up for you?" The students looked down at their feet, their shoulders hunched over in the chill. Someone finally responded, "In my family, we didn't talk about death much at all. So today has been the most I've spoken about dying in a long time." A young woman studying forestry said she'd never thought about the role of conservation at cemeteries. "I didn't think burials had anything to do with the environment." They were somber at the cemetery from the cold, but they had plenty to say on the final exam when asked to explore the connection between death and the future of the earth. "My mother has multiple autoimmune diseases. She speaks about assisted suicide," wrote one student. "I tell her all the time I don't want to discuss it, but I think when I go home, I'm finally going to sit down and talk with her." She continued, "I was taken aback at how different this cemetery was. It didn't feel like this packed, claustrophobic, liminal space of death. This, to me, is what I consider a final resting place, one in which family members could visit and take a therapeutic hike on the trails." Other students were equally affected. "I lost 2 really important people since coming to college," one wrote. "I wished I could have buried my grandfather and my best friend in a similar place. It turned something so painful into something beautiful and alive. It broadened my understanding of how important the land can be, in this case as a way to honor the deceased." So I can see why I was glad I didn't cancel class that day. And part of this, for me, and at this cemetery, there's no embalming and no concrete vaults, and everything is biodegradable. So that's essentially the definition of green burial. But you can do green burial in a lot of different places. This was a conservation cemetery, that scene. Like my father was buried in a neighborhood cemetery where he just asked, do you require vaults? And they didn't.
So whenever you write a book, you then share it with readers, and readers obviously react and probably reach out to you and speak to you. And I'm curious, in the time that this book has been out, are there particular folk in particular stories or examples of how folks have responded that if you were somehow going to add an extra chapter to the book, or are there particular ways in which people have shared their stories with you about either experiences of death or how they're thinking about their lives now in light of the book?
I think the main thing is that I've had just so many conversations, I mean, this is, I don't know if any of y'all are in book clubs, but like, I'm in a book club, and I've been in a book club with the same 8 women for, I don't know, 18 years. And it wasn't until we read my book. My daughter said I forced them. I did not force my book club to read my book. But I have known these women through everything. And we had not talked about what are our family histories around death until last week. So just the talking about it is one thing, and we all have permission to have those conversations. The other conversations that have happened, I just got an email. I was telling Brian about this earlier from Reverend David McNair, who's an Episcopal priest in Mars Hill. Susan knows David. And he said, we're reading your book with my wife and her 96-year-old father. And we're talking about his final wishes, and he's going to go and visit Carolina Memorial Sanctuary. So just those reflecting on choices.
In the book, you also mention a friend of ours, theologian at Duke, who you end up giving her some guidance about decisions, both for her and her husband. And you and I both think a lot of this theologian, but again, I think watching you almost be an evangelist, if you will, to invite people to reflect on this and how much you really sort of put her at ease about they now had a plan consistent with their life and their values. I know this book is leading ultimately to what you want to say to Maya and what you want to say to Annie Skye, and I'm curious if you want to give us that part of the story as far as what you've decided to say to the girls.
Yeah, I think I also want to share, because part of that is connected to what happened, the story of Warren Wilson, which I haven't.
Yes, Ray and the vault.
Yeah, so, and I can either share that or read it either. Yeah. But I'll just in brief. Part of the take home for this book was like how little we can know about let me rephrase that. How little I could know about my surroundings. But I mean, there's only so much we can absorb, or at least that's how I feel, And one of the things that I learned was that there's a cemetery at Warren Wilson College that I had known about, but I'm embarrassed to say I had mistook it for another cemetery owned by a church. I mean, it's an innocent enough mistake, I guess. All these years, I thought it was a different cemetery. And so finally, when I'm doing this book, I was like, oh, I actually thought the book would end with me choosing Carolina Memorial Sanctuary because it is such an amazing place. But along the way, I realized, okay, there's a cemetery at Warren Wilson, and I need to find it. So it's like less than a mile from my house. I rent a little duplex on campus. It's an idyllic little cemetery. The gravestones are flat on the ground, so it's very easy to miss. That's what I'm telling myself, because I had driven past it. So I was so excited to visit it for the first time. And then I realized that their contract required vaults. So I had never even seen a vault until I started research for this book. I have met priests who've never seen a vault. It's the concrete that is often buried in the hole, the ground, right? And the function it serves is primarily for landscaping. It keeps the land level for mowing. So a big part of this book ended up being the dialogue and often debate between me and the 86-year-old Presbyterian trustee of the cemetery, Ray Stock, who had stock in maintaining that cemetery and did not want things changed. So a big part of the book is our dialogue with each other. And, I don't really have to read the whole scene, but I can just tell you that it involved a Zoom call at the start of the pandemic. Like, I don't know, remember how graceful we all were at Zoom calls at the start of the pandemic? I wasn't. But it was a Zoom call with me and 3 men. Actually, it was 4 men. The cemetery trustees and Steve Runhold, who's the Presbyterian pastor. So what ended up happening is, like, Ray was muted, somebody else, you couldn't see them. It was this chaotic Zoom call. But we ended up having a discussion together about the need for a concrete vault or not. And so in the end, they went to the cemetery to actually vote. I had asked for an exemption for the contract based on my religious beliefs as an Episcopalian, my need to care for creation. And there had been one other student, a Muslim student, who had been buried without a vault, because Muslims and in the Jewish faith, you don't bury with a vault and you don't embalm. So anyway, the short of the long is that Ray had said no to me all year long. And at that meeting in the cemetery, in the height of pandemic, he said, I don't think we should grant the exemption. I wasn't there. It was just the guys. and they said, okay, Ray. And he said, I think we should change the policy. So they changed the policy to not need the vaults. And honestly, the vault is, at this point, it doesn't mess up with the landscaping. You can still mow. I mean, my parents' gravesite did not have a vault, but it was a big deal, though, for him to make that change. And he died at 86, a month after that. And he had given all the paperwork for the cemetery to the next person in line. So it was this, and a fund had been set up to maintain the cemetery by his family in his honor. So it was, really beautiful.
Well, and what I appreciated is the ways in which you stayed engaged with him. And
I offered to cook them all dinner. I was
Yes,
so
yes.
pathetic. I was like,
so in a moment, we're going to take some time for Q&A, but
Yeah.
before we do that, I do want you
I'm going to read this.
to read the letter to
Yeah.
Maya.
I'm just going to read the last. I just wanted to tell you all that story, because that story to me, like the heart of the book to me, was those interactions between people who know each other. So I'm not going to give away the ending of the book, but I'm going to share with you the 2 paragraphs, and then we'll be able to have some time for questions. So this is a letter to my daughters, in addition, like similar to the letter my dad gave to me. So every person listed in this plan is someone I encountered during this journey. They have given their lives to help people live with death. I'm grateful they might be able to help you too. Then you can do the same for someone else one day. This past summer, I attended the funeral of my mom's only brother, Cecil, a 78-year-old Episcopal priest who directed the church camp started by my grandparents in Mississippi. Because of the pandemic, I watched the service via Facebook Live as a small group of relatives sat distanced on wooden benches by the lake. I have a photo on our bookshelf of my grandfather, also a priest, paddling a canoe on this same lake with my mom as a child in the boat. Through generations that come before us, we are shaped by the land, how we live, and how we die. Honoring my parents after their deaths and living into their love for the earth has been one of the defining, unexpected paths of my life. I experience my parents' love in my body nearly every day, and that feels like God to me, even when I'm scared about what will happen next. You too will carry my love everywhere you go. And if you can't follow that plan, remember what Annie Skye once said, if mom's dead, she'll never know. But she'll always know I love you.
Awesome. Questions that you might have? If you've either read the book and you have a question, or there's a mic here if you want to give them the mic. Anyone?
I was amazed at how much damage embalming does. I don't think
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think that's also an assumption sometimes that I make that's known. I appreciate you bringing that up. My dad growing up would say embalming is injecting toxic chemicals into your body after you've died. And that is essentially what it is. And that in itself may not be a problem if that's, if there are reasons for embalming, but then you're burying that body into the earth. And, I think I want to be really clear I try to be clear in the book that I'm not saying like this choice isn't right for you. I'm looking at what choices are right for me. Culturally, there are some groups that embalming is a very important part of their historical practices. But embalming doesn't go back in history that far. It started in the Civil War. So in terms of history, it's got a fairly short history. And we're one of the few countries where embalming is still continued. Just flame cremation is chosen by 50% of people, and it's expected to grow to 80% by 2040. With more options, we'll see how that happens. I appreciate you bringing that up, though. The embalming and the vault, those are the two issues related to environmental impacts that I was really going to avoid. Sure. Thank you for that.
Yes. Actually, you just wait. It's coming to you.
Yeah, well, it's okay.
And we also have folks on the live stream, so yeah.
Thank you. For the Carolina Sanctuary you talked about, or conservation type places, do those involve a casket or a pine box or just the body?
No, that's a great question. Tell me your first name?
Mercy.
Mercy, okay. That's a great question, Mercy. And the question was, like, at conservation cemeteries, do they involve a casket or is it just a body? The key with green burial, whether it's at a conservation cemetery or your neighborhood cemetery, is that everything has to be biodegradable. Now, that's like not that hard. It means you're not going to be buried in a metal casket. So a pine casket is fine. You could be buried in a shroud. My father wanted to be wrapped in my mother's linens as a shroud and then put in a pine casket, so that's what we did. There are shroud burials at conservation cemeteries. There are caskets that are pine caskets. There are willow caskets rather. And I want to be clear too that conservation cemeteries also bury cremated remains as well. Those are great questions.
Any other questions? Yes, and here comes. Well, so here's a mic, and then it'll come to you.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you go first.
What is the difference between the burial you just described and human composting?
Just to clarify, the one I just described, like a green burial. Okay, so with a green burial, you can imagine like a burial like many of us have seen where the body is put into a hole in the ground, essentially. With body composting, and one of the companies, if you want to look it up, is called Recompose. So that's the first company who's the head of Recompose did a lot of the research around human composting in Seattle. With that, you're not burying a body, but rather the body is going into a system, essentially, where organic material is added, and after a month, you have essentially like composted soil. So basically you're getting a wheelbarrow full of soil if you want it, or they donate the soil to a conservation project. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Can you speak about the role of a death doula?
Oh, yeah. That's such a great question. As a part of this book, I was able to interview a number of death doulas. And oh my gosh, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to meditate more. Like, I want to be more like y'all. The death doulas I interviewed were just grounded people. Just to clarify, some folks call themselves death doulas, some call themselves end-of-life doulas. It's the same thing, but some prefer one term or another, I learned. So just as there are doulas for birth, there are now also doulas for the death process. So this would be somebody that you might, invite into your home to assist someone as they're dying. It's from hospice. Hospice serves a function that's so important, but a death doula would be much like you might have a doctor or midwife at a birth, and a death doula is really there to provide that personal and emotional support. And there you can look up, there's organizations of death doulas around, yeah.
And we have a death doula right here.
Oh, God.
Yes.
Ah!
'Cause
Wait, do you like death doula or end-of-life doula? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
My name is Bob. Can you speak briefly about the Muslim and Jewish traditions in death and burial?
Yeah. So in short, they espouse green burial. There's not embalming and not vaults in both faith traditions. So that is, there's a lot more detail, like in terms of the body facing Mecca in the Muslim faith, but the bottom line is we have precedents, we have examples of death that doesn't hurt the earth and doesn't harm, it doesn't contribute to climate change from those two faith traditions.
Billy.
So I'm someone who's very concerned about practices and the forms that our habits take. And I'm curious, as someone who has buried a lot of folk in my life, the vault and the grass covering over the fake grass covering over the dirt at the grave, there's a desperate attempt by the funeral directors to hide all of that. And I'm curious, in your research, writings, reflections, if you've thought much about how that process of the vault and the casket and the covering over the dirt actually prevents a family from mourning the death of the one they love.
That's like the whole reason for the book.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Yeah. Not to discount the question. I mean that in a, my answer is yes. I have thought about that. And, the message of the book that I want to leave with y'all is that just like we get to choose what kind of milk we buy, we get to choose how the people who are left after we die, how they're going to engage on some level with our death. And that choice, we're not going to be there at that time, obviously, but we can put into play some practices, like you said, that might connect them to our lives by connecting them to our deaths. And I think that's what, with my dad was like, I don't want that fake grass. It wasn't like he had a big deal aversion to fake grass. It was that the representation of the distance that creates. He was like, I want those shovels by the gravesite, and I want kids to be able to shovel graves. And he'd seen it first at Geralt's. I'm pointing at Betty. He'd seen, the first time he'd seen a burial, where the family got to close the grave and shovel the dirt was at Sewanee, when Geralt was a family member was,
So one last question, okay? Just to be clear, in East Tennessee, when we choose milk, we choose Mayfield. Okay, let's just be, so.
Some people might use almond milk too.
I'm just saying, East Tennessee.
Narrow Ridge Earth Literacy Center in Washburn, Tennessee, has green burials. And I know there was a parishioner from Ascension who was buried there within the last couple of years.
It's in I have a line.
Phyllis Leonard Turner. Yeah.
Well, introduce me, because there is a line in the book from there.
Yes, Narrow Ridge Earth Literacy Center has the first actual natural burial ground in the state of Tennessee. And it's only 30 miles from here. That's where I'm from. And I've got some brochures. If you're interested at all in knowing more about it, we buried 3 people last week, all natural burial.
Awesome.
And we have 200 sites reserved. We have about 550 acres there at Narrow Ridge. So if anyone's interested, we don't charge.
That's what I was going to say. It's in the book. I can't believe that we get to meet. Thank you so much. I'm excited. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Father Billy. At this point, and is Tori still here from Union Avenue Books?
Yeah.
Hey, Tori. So I know many of you bought books coming in. Tori's going to still have books for sale in the back. And also, this is a great book, but also continue to support Union Avenue Books. It's a great resource in our community. Do not take it for granted. So thank you, Tori. Wave again, Tori. Thank you. And then Mallory will be in the back signing books. And sir, I'll definitely encourage you to put your brochures there with Mallory.
And I hope you'll stay by to talk with people too. Can I say one last thing? Is that one thing that's been funny, because the book came out in December, right around the holidays, and I was surprised and heartened, because a lot of people who wanted to have these conversations with people they loved, they're like, I'm going to give the book, and it was like it was the entry point to the conversations. So that was kind of neat.
Sure. Let's thank Mallory for being with us tonight. So why don't you scoot your way out there, and you'll be at the table. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Go ahead.